The night was warm in Orlando, the kind of humid summer air that clung to skin and softened the glow of city lights. Inside the modest concert hall, the stage still held the aftertaste of music guitar cables coiled like veins, amplifiers humming with residual energy, and the faint perfume of applause lingering like incense. Christina Grimmie had just finished performing. At only 22, her voice had carried with a sincerity that silenced chatter and wrapped itself around the audience like a prayer disguised as a pop song. Backstage, her laughter was quiet, almost fragile, as if she could hardly believe the adoration directed toward her. She was not a superstar commanding arenas, but in that room, she was everything. A voice, a dream, a constellation bright enough to anchor hope. Outside the main hall, fans lined up for the meet and greet, some trembling with the anticipation of proximity, others clutching posters, phones, or gifts. It was an ordinary ritual in the world of celebrity, the moment when strangers became, for a heartbeat, something closer. The clock edged past 10 p.m. Its hands, indifferent and steady, moved toward a time no one inside the venue could yet imagine. Christina, radiant but tired, prepared herself to greet each fan with the same generous warmth she was known for. She had built her career on openness, answering messages, sharing pieces of herself online, dissolving the boundary between performer and listener. To love Christina Grimmie was to believe you truly knew her. And in some ways, that was true. But shadows often travel in the same direction as light. Somewhere in the crowd that gathered was a figure unlike the others, not trembling from joy, but carrying a silence so deep it seemed carved from stone. A man stood among them, eyes fixed, waiting not for music or autograph, but for something darker. The bags he carried looked ordinary, blending into the mosaic of merchandise and belongings. Inside, they concealed the instruments of an ending. In the stillness before the storm, Christina moved with grace. Witnesses later recalled how she opened her arms wide, welcoming each admirer with a hug. It was not a staged embrace, but an instinctive gesture, unguarded, trusting, as if she could fold every person into the safety of her own heart. She did not know that such trust would, in moments, become the fulcrum of her fate. A mirror leaned against the backstage wall, caught her reflection as she passed, a fleeting glimpse of a young woman at the height of her promise. The mirror showed no shadows, no hint of what lay waiting. And yet, mirrors are indifferent to time. They only reflect what is, never what will be. Outside, thunder pressed faintly in the distance, the weather rolling unseen beyond the venue walls. A storm was gathering over Orlando, one of heat and static, the kind that breaks open the sky in sudden violence. Inside, however, the air was filled with anticipation, laughter, and the easy rhythm of young fans shifting forward in line. Christina Grimmie's story was not supposed to end here. She was not supposed to be a cautionary tale, nor a headline, nor a tragic echo in the archives of fame. On that night, in the ordinary glow of stage lights and cell phone cameras, she was only a young woman with music still in her veins, extending her hand to the world. The clock ticked forward again. The storm edged closer. Long before Orlando, long before the lights and the whispers of fame, Christina Grimmie was just a girl in Marlton, New Jersey. Born in 1994, she seemed like any other child, small, spirited, soft-spoken, but inside her lived something larger, something that belonged to the air more than to the ground. Music entered her early, not as background, but as necessity. The piano was her first confidant, her first escape. She would sit for hours, pressing keys with fingers that felt too small for the size of the sound they conjured. Her mother noticed it first, that strange alignment of voice and soul. Christina could sing with a depth that made her seem older, as though she carried echoes from lives she had never lived. When she sang, it was not performance, it was release, the invisible weight inside her reshaping itself into melody. By her teenage years, The world outside her home seemed too narrow for what was inside her. She turned to a platform few took seriously in those days: YouTube. A camera, a keyboard, and the quiet of her bedroom became the stage from which she would address the world. In that small, unadorned space, Christina recorded covers that spread with the quiet urgency of wildfire. Her Just a Dream duet with Sam Tsui would eventually reach millions, but in the beginning, it was simpler, song after song, uploaded into the digital void, her voice traveling unseen wires into living rooms and headphones across the globe. Her fans were not casual. They spoke of her not with the detached admiration reserved for celebrities, but with the intimacy reserved for friends. She responded to comments, remembered usernames, built a small kingdom of belonging. She was, in many ways, a pioneer of the digital intimacy we take for granted today. But with intimacy comes exposure. The more she opened herself, the more she belonged not only to those who loved her, but to those who needed her in ways she could not control. It was here, in the glow of a computer screen, that her mythology began. She was not polished like a studio creation. She was raw, unfiltered, a teenager with messy hair and a voice that bent metal. To watch Christina Grimmie sing was to feel that the world had suddenly shifted, that something extraordinary had been hidden in plain sight all along. But success is rarely innocent. As her subscriber count climbed into the hundreds of thousands, her life changed in subtle ways. Classmates began to look at her differently. Invitations arrived. She was still the girl from Marlton, but Marlton itself began to feel smaller, like a town she was already outgrowing. One night, while recording a cover, her computer froze. On the screen, her face was captured mid-song, mouth open, eyes half closed, frozen between notes. She stared at her own still image, struck by the eerie thought that moments, once recorded, outlive their owners. She laughed it off, rebooted, and tried again. Yet that fleeting stillness, the image of herself suspended in time, would linger. The motif of the frozen moment would return again and again in her life. Photos, videos, echoes of a voice recorded and replayed endlessly. Christina Grimmie was building an afterlife for herself long before she ever knew she would need one. And still, in her parents' home, the clock ticked steadily in the hallway. She was just a girl on the cusp of something vast, not yet aware of the shadows that gather around light, not yet aware that even the purest music can summon storms. By 2014, Christina Grimmie's voice was no longer confined to bedrooms and laptop speakers. She stepped onto a stage that millions would watch. The Voice, Season 6. When she sang Miley Cyrus's Wrecking Ball in her blind audition, the room shifted. The first notes rose trembling, then strengthened into something undeniable, and within seconds, all 4 judges turned their chairs. The moment carried a cinematic force. The small-town girl, eyes wide but unflinching, summoning a sound bigger than her own body. Christina chose Adam Levine as her coach. Their rapport became one of the season's defining narratives, the seasoned rock star guiding the young digital-born prodigy. She advanced quickly, dazzling not just with raw power, but with a tonal purity that seemed to carry hidden grief, like a church hymn that lingers in the air long after it's sung. Fame, however, is double-edged. The camera's embrace is affectionate but unrelenting. Under its gaze, Christina became both idol and commodity. Articles appeared, interviews multiplied, and strangers began to debate her like a character in a story rather than a living person. Some praised her humility and her faith. Others dissected her wardrobe, her gestures, her body. With each broadcast, she was less Marlton's daughter and more America's possession. The motif of light became inescapable. Studio lights, harsh and sterile, burned against her skin. Spotlight followed her wherever she stood, bleaching out the shadows and forcing her to shine. To live in such light is intoxicating, but it is also blinding. It reveals everything while protecting nothing. Christina, with her open smile and nervous giggle, endured it with grace. But even she admitted privately to friends that she felt the pressure of being perfect in front of millions. Despite the pressure, she made it to the finals. Millions voted. Millions invested their hope into her fragile frame. When she was eliminated in third place, many cried foul. But for Christina, the result was less important than the door it opened. She left The Voice not as a runner-up, but as an undeniable star, with a future shaped not by rankings but by possibility. And yet, hidden beneath the euphoria, the first cracks of exposure had formed. Fans, who once adored her, became possessive. Online comments blurred between love and obsession, between devotion and entitlement. Some wrote as though they knew her intimately. Others as though she owed them something unseen. To Christina, these were only words scattered across the digital void. But words, like seeds, grow when given attention. In the months after the show, she began touring. Small venues at first, then larger. At each stop, she met fans with open arms, never pulling away, never guarded. She was too earnest, too gentle, to place distance between herself and the people who adored her. This intimacy was her gift, but also her risk. For Christina Grimmie, the line between fan and friend was blurred almost to invisibility. One evening after rehearsal, she sat alone in a dimly lit green room, scrolling through her phone. Her reflection in the darkened window doubled her image. Christina Grimmie, two selves, one public, one private, layered upon each other. She pressed her forehead to the glass, humming softly, as if asking the silent reflection which self was more real. It was a question she could not yet answer. And as the reflection gazed back at her, wordless, the clock on the wall clicked forward, indifferent to which self would ultimately survive. Fandom is a delicate thing, half love, half projection. For Christina Grimmie, it was both the wind beneath her wings and the storm cloud gathering on the horizon. She treated her fans with a generosity that few artists of her caliber ever dared. After shows, she would stay long after the last autograph was signed, hugging each person as if they were not strangers but cousins she hadn't seen in years. Online, she replied to messages late into the night, her words intimate and casual, like handwritten notes passed under a classroom desk. For many, she was more than a singer. She was a confidant, a beacon, the proof that someone ordinary could become extraordinary without losing their kindness. But beneath that intimacy lay a fragile edge. When a performer opens herself so completely, she risks becoming a mirror for desires that aren't hers. To the healthy, her openness inspired gratitude. To the unstable, it suggested possession. Christina became, unwittingly, a canvas onto which others painted their loneliness, their longing, even their rage. By 2015, small fissures in the relationship began to show. She received letters that were too personal, too insistent. Messages that moved from admiration to obsession. She brushed them off with good humor, choosing to see the love rather than the danger. Friends noticed, however, that her inbox sometimes unsettled her, that she would scroll through messages with a faint crease between her brows. Still, Christina refused to harden herself. She was guided by faith and by the conviction that kindness could dissolve darkness. If someone needs love, she once told a fellow performer, I want to give it. She believed in the power of human connection, even when it frayed at the edges. There is an eerie symbolism in the letters she kept in a small box at home. Some were sweet, drawings and poems from young fans. Others were haunting in their devotion, promising eternal loyalty, swearing their lives to her in ink. The box became a kind of shrine, tokens of admiration, but also, perhaps, warnings sealed in envelopes. Her family, protective yet trusting, worried in small, private ways. Her brother Mark often accompanied her to shows, not only as support but as a quiet shield. He sensed, more than she admitted, that her openness was both a gift and a risk. Be careful, he would say sometimes. She would smile, dismissive, as if to say the world was too good to hurt her. But obsession, once born, does not rest. In hidden rooms and lonely apartments, fans replayed her videos endlessly, tracing the same notes, the same gestures. Some convinced themselves she was speaking directly to them, that their bond was not imagined, but destined. This is the fragile edge of fandom, where admiration dissolves into fixation, and fixation curdles into something darker. In late-night rehearsals, Christina sometimes caught herself staring into empty seats, imagining faces she could not see. The silence of an unlit venue felt heavy, as if eyes lingered there even without bodies. She shook it off, chalking it up to nerves, but the feeling never entirely vanished. The philosopher Kierkegaard once wrote that despair is not merely the absence of hope, but the misdirection of it hope, twisted towards something that cannot answer. Christina's openness had invited hope, but in some, it became misdirected into possession, into obsession. And obsession, left unchecked, waits patiently for a chance to reveal itself. The line between fan and stranger, between devotion and danger, was thinner than she realized. And somewhere, in the growing silence of her rising fame, someone had already crossed it. The clock ticked on. Another letter arrived. And in the margin of Christina Grimmie's life, a shadow deepened. Orlando, the 10th of June, 2016. The Plaza Live was not an arena, not a stadium, but a modest venue with faded carpet and rows of folding chairs that squeaked when shifted. It was the kind of place where the lights were functional rather than dazzling, where the ceiling fans hummed faintly over the applause. Christina Grimmie, touring as an opening act for Before You Exit, stood at the center of it all. The stage only a few feet above the floor. The separation between performer and audience almost non-existent. The night carried a strange intimacy. Fans had arrived early, some holding handwritten signs, others whispering excitedly about finally seeing her in person. For many, Christina was not just a celebrity. She was a friend who had sung them through heartbreak, through loneliness, through the fragile turbulence of adolescence. Her voice, carried from a bedroom in New Jersey to the glow of YouTube, had become the thread tying them to something larger. Inside, the air smelled faintly of sweat, soda, and the sweet tang of anticipation. Christina's performance was luminous, but unpretentious. She wore simple clothes, the kind of outfit that said she was one of them, not above them. The music rose and fell, chords reverberating against the low ceiling. For those in the crowd, it was not just a concert, it was communion. What no one noticed was the man in the back, silent, unremarkable, blending into the anonymity of shadow. He had driven from another state, carrying with him 2 handguns and a hunting knife, all concealed in ordinary bags. To the ushers at the door, he was just another fan, quiet and forgettable. He passed through the entrance without a second glance. The systems meant to protect her security checks, body scans. The invisible nets of vigilance were not in place. In their absence, darkness walked through unchallenged. As Christina sang, he stood unmoving, his eyes fixed, his mind elsewhere. No one who saw him later could recall him smiling, clapping, or singing along. He was a shadow among the faithful, a silence amid music. The concert ended as concerts always do, with applause echoing into the rafters, the sound swelling and then fading like a tide receding. Christina bowed, her hair falling forward, her smile bright but tired. She thanked the crowd, her voice gentle but firm, and then disappeared backstage for only a moment before returning for what she believed was the most important part, meeting them. The line for the meet and greet formed quickly, coiling through the venue like a patient serpent. Fans clutched posters and phones, gifts wrapped in ribbons, photographs waiting to be signed. Some trembled, others rehearsed what they would say when they finally stood before her. The air, once filled with music, was now saturated with expectancy. At the far end of the hall, the silent figures stepped into line. No one turned their head. No one sensed the storm concealed beneath his quiet exterior. He was simply another body in a long queue of devotion, moving closer, inch by inch, toward the front. Christina, for her part, was radiant still. Witnesses recall how she greeted each person with warmth that seemed endless, as if fatigue never touched her. She offered hugs, wide-armed, unhesitating, a gesture as intimate as it was dangerous. Her brother Mark stood nearby, scanning the line with casual vigilance, though even he could not have guessed what waited ahead. A clock hung on the wall, its second hand dragging forward in steady arcs. To anyone else, it was only time keeping order. But to Christina Grimmie, though she did not know it, each tick marked the shrinking distance between life and its violent end. And outside, above Orlando, the storm that had been threatening all evening broke open at last. Lightning split the sky. Rain hammered the streets. Nature itself seemed to echo what was about to unfold inside the small, unguarded hall. He entered the line with the quiet obedience of any other fan. His name was Kevin Loibel, though to most of the world before that night, he had been no one. A reclusive man from St. Petersburg, Florida, he lived in the confines of a dim apartment where curtains were always drawn. His co-workers described him as withdrawn, awkward, a man who rarely spoke, yet inside his silence, an obsession had been fed and nurtured. Loibel had followed Christina Grimmie online, his fascination hardening into fixation. He altered his body in the service of that obsession: eye surgery, hair transplants, weight loss. Co-workers recalled how he bragged, in strange bursts of confidence, that she would recognize him, that he would make her his. They thought it was harmless fantasy, but in his mind, the line between admiration and entitlement had already dissolved. That evening, he packed his bags, 2 handguns, a hunting knife, and extra ammunition. He showered, shaved, dressed in clean clothes, and drove east across Florida, toward the venue where Christina would sing. To the outside world, he was just another fan. To himself, he was a man on the cusp of a destiny only he could see. Inside the Plaza Live, as the line moved forward, Loibel's silence deepened. Witnesses remembered him standing stiff, unsmiling, eyes locked not on those around him but on the young woman at the end of the line. Each step closer was a drumbeat in his chest, the pulse of an obsession that had crossed the threshold into violence. There was no metal detector at the door, no pat-down, no search. Orlando police would later admit the venue's security measures were minimal, suited for concerts where the greatest threat was a rowdy drunk or a fan sneaking in alcohol. The possibility of a man walking in with concealed weapons seemed unimaginable until it wasn't. Christina, meanwhile, remained unguarded, unaware. She embraced one fan after another, her arms spread wide in a gesture that felt more like family than formality. She laughed, posed for photographs, signed posters. To those who loved her, the moment was proof that kindness could exist even in fame. And then, he was there. Kevin Loibel stepped forward. Witnesses later said Christina extended her arms for a hug, the same open gesture she had given everyone else. She did not hesitate. She did not recoil. For an instant, there was nothing but the simplicity of her welcome, the trust of a performer who believed love could not betray her. In his bag, the weapons waited. His hand moved. Time seemed to stutter, to fracture into unbearable stillness. The motif of the mirror returned here, though no mirror stood nearby. Instead, the reflection was internal. 2 selves colliding: Christina, with her arms wide, embodying openness. Loibel, carrying within him a dark echo of that same openness twisted into possession. In that reflection, light and shadow met, and the result was violence poised at the edge of release. Security had not noticed him. The crowd had not sensed him. The world itself had not paused to warn her. And yet, the clock on the wall ticked forward without hesitation. The storm outside raged louder, thunder shaking the windows, as if nature alone understood what was about to unfold. Kevin Loibl, unnoticed until that instant, was no longer a shadow in the line. He had become the storm itself, and Christina Grimmie stood directly in its path. The line moved, the space between them collapsed, and for one fragile heartbeat, Christina Grimmie stood as she always had, with arms wide open, trusting, luminous. It was a gesture she had given to hundreds before him, a gesture of welcome, of recognition, of love. And in that instant, the gesture was answered not with embrace, but with the sound of metal leaving cloth, of intention becoming action. The gun appeared almost invisibly. Witnesses would later struggle to recall the exact moment, the glint of steel, the motion of his hand, the shift in Christina's face from surprise to pain. What they remembered most was the sound. The sharp, concussive crack of gunfire erupted in the small room, echoing against cinder-block walls, louder than any song that had filled the venue earlier. 3 shots. The first 2 struck Christina directly, collapsing the space between life and death in seconds. She fell backward, her body folding as if in disbelief. The third was silenced by her brother Mark, who hurled himself onto the gunman with the instinctive fury of protection. In that instant, brother and killer grappled, the weapon clattering against their bodies, the crowd screaming, frozen between flight and shock. Loibl fired once more, not at Christina this time, but at himself. The bullet ended his life instantly. He crumpled beside her, the scene grotesque in its symmetry. The singer and her killer, side by side on a floor still sticky with spilled soda from earlier in the night. The room dissolved into chaos. Fans screamed, stumbled, scrambled for the exit. Others dropped to their knees, trying to help, pressing trembling hands against Christina's wounds, as if sheer desperation could reverse the damage. Mark, wild-eyed, called out for help, his voice ragged, a sound no sibling should ever have to make. But even in chaos, silence found its way back. After the shots, after the initial panic, there was a stillness so heavy it felt unnatural, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Christina lay motionless, the echo of her openness cruelly inverted into stillness. The arms that had reached to embrace now rested lifeless at her sides. In the aftermath, objects took on strange significance. The poster someone had dropped on the ground, smudged with blood. A shoe left behind in the frantic rush. The meet and greet table, scattered with uncapped Sharpies and discarded water bottles, transformed into a kind of accidental altar. Each item became a relic, saturated with the weight of what had happened there. Time fractured for those inside. Seconds stretched, distorted. For Christina, the line between sound and silence, between life and the shadow beyond, blurred irreversibly. For her brother, each second was an eternity, a fight against the inevitable. Outside, rain battered the roof of the venue, the storm unrelenting. Lightning illuminated the parking lot in violent flashes, as if the world itself was marking the moment. Inside, the electricity flickered once, briefly dimming the room before steadying again. In that flicker, the scene seemed suspended. Christina on the ground, her brother clutching her, the gunman lifeless nearby. A tableau of devotion, betrayal, and irreversible loss. The philosopher Camus once suggested that the absurd is born when human longing collides with the silent indifference of the world. In that Orlando venue, longing had met indifference with devastating clarity. A young woman whose only crime was openness had been struck down by a man whose longing had twisted into violence. And as the ambulance sirens pierced the rain-soaked night, Christina Grimmie was carried away, her final embrace left unfinished, her voice silenced mid-song. The sound of sirens cut through the humid Orlando night, rising and falling like a mournful chorus. Outside the Plaza Live, flashing lights painted the rain-slick pavement in alternating washes of red and blue. Inside, paramedics rushed to Christina Grimmie, their movements efficient but shadowed by urgency. by the unspoken knowledge of how much blood had already been lost. Her brother Mark followed close as they lifted her onto a stretcher, his clothes stained, his hands trembling. Witnesses described his face as hollow, a mask of disbelief frozen mid-scream. Fans who had not fled stood pressed against the walls, some crying uncontrollably, others eerily silent, unable to reconcile the reality before them with the warmth they had felt from Christina only minutes earlier. The venue was transformed. What had been a place of joy now resembled a scene of ruin. Abandoned shoes, crumpled programs, cell phones recording nothing but muffled chaos littered the floor. The gunman's body lay covered, faceless, stripped of the menace he had carried in life. And in the center, where Christina had stood offering embraces, there remained only a void, an emptiness so stark it seemed to hum with its own silence. As the ambulance pulled away, the rain began to lessen, but the heaviness in the air did not. At Orlando Regional Medical Center, doctors fought to stabilize her. Machines beeped steadily. Sterile light washed over her fragile frame. Nurses whispered urgently. Doctors issued clipped commands. Yet for all their skill, time remained their enemy. Christina's injuries were catastrophic, and the clock, as ever, ticked on with indifference. Back at the venue, police cordoned off the scene. They interviewed witnesses, took photographs, bagged evidence. The questions began immediately. How had the gunman entered so easily? Why had there been no security checks? Could anyone have stopped him sooner? Each answer was incomplete, each explanation unsatisfying. In the silence between questions, the truth loomed heavy. Christina Grimmie had been left vulnerable in a world where danger no longer required warning. When the announcement came, it spread not with words but with gasps, texts, and cries that broke across the night like shattered glass. Christina Grimmie was gone. 22 years old. A voice silenced, a promise unfulfilled. News outlets scrambled. Headlines multiplied, each one framing the same horror in slightly different words. Singer shot after concert. The voice star killed. A life cut short. Images of Christina's radiant smile were paired with images of the venue taped off in yellow, of fans clutching flowers outside the hospital, of candles flickering against the damp Florida night. The motif of silence returned. For those who loved her, silence was the cruelest sound. The silence of the phone that would never ring again. The silence of her YouTube channel now frozen in time. The silence of an embrace that would never be completed. Even in her absence, the silence carried her presence, heavy and unrelenting. Mark, her brother, would later be hailed as a hero for tackling the gunman, preventing further carnage. But in that moment, heroism was drowned by grief. He had saved many lives, yet the one he loved most had slipped beyond his reach. This paradox of victory entwined with loss would haunt him, as it would haunt her family, for years to come. And as dawn crept toward Orlando, as the rain gave way to pale light, Christina Grimmie's death became not just a personal tragedy, but a public reckoning. A reminder that the line between love and violence, between fandom and obsession, between stage and grave, can collapse in the span of a heartbeat. The world woke to her absence. The music stopped, and the silence became unbearable. Morning light crept reluctantly across Orlando, pale and unforgiving. In the aftermath of Christina Grimmie's death, questions surged faster than answers. Police held press conferences, their language clinical, almost antiseptic facts distilled into bullet points. The shooter's name, his age, his weapons, the absence of any prior criminal record. Yet, the clinical tone only deepened the unease. Nothing they said could explain why. Kevin Loibl left no manifesto, no recorded message, no explanation for his obsession turned lethal. He had destroyed his computer's hard drive, scrubbed his phone, erased the trail that might have revealed his reasoning. His family offered only fragments. He was a loner, distant, troubled. Co-workers recalled odd comments, unrequited fantasies. But in the end, his motive lay sealed in silence. This absence of clarity gnawed at those left behind. For Christina's parents, for Mark, for her closest friends, the lack of answers was its own cruelty. Why her? Why then? Why in such a way? Without motive, grief had no shape, no target. The killer was dead, the crime complete, and yet closure remained impossibly out of reach. The venue itself became an emblem of the questions. Why no metal detectors? Why no security checks for bags? The Plaza Live had been treated like a neighborhood theater, a safe place for intimate music. But the intimacy that made it inviting also left it exposed. Security experts flooded the news with hindsight. Stricter screening could have stopped him. Trained guards could have intervened. Each sentence was heavy with the unbearable, if only. Fans, too, searched for meaning. Online, tributes flooded in drawings, cover songs, messages written in trembling text. Yet, alongside grief, suspicion simmered. Was this an act of obsession alone, or was there something deeper? Whispers of conspiracy rose, not from evidence, but from the human need to make chaos coherent. How could a young woman of faith, of kindness, of such improbable talent, die at the hands of a stranger without reason? For some, the only explanation was that the truth had been hidden, that something larger was at play. But the official story offered no such closure. Investigators declared Loibl had acted alone. No accomplices, no broader plan, no discernible motive. He came, he killed, he vanished into self-inflicted silence. The case was closed almost as soon as it began, yet in the quiet spaces of memory, questions lingered. Christina's brother replayed the moment endlessly. Could he have reached sooner, pushed harder, shouted faster? Her parents asked themselves if they should have worried more about security, if they should have warned her against meeting strangers so freely. Fans scrolled through her last tweets, her last Instagram posts, searching for hidden signals, for some unspoken foreshadowing that might have warned them all. The motif of the clock returned here. At the hospital, a clock ticked mercilessly in the waiting room as her family prayed. At home, the clocks on her parents' walls kept moving, indifferent, while time inside their hearts froze at the moment the gunshots rang out. Time, in its relentless march, offered no mercy, no pause to absorb the weight of loss. And still, beneath all the unanswered questions, one truth remained clear. Christina Grimmie was gone, taken not by illness or accident, but by the calculated act of another human being. This knowledge made her absence heavier, her silence more suffocating. Death had not been natural, it had been forced. In the weeks that followed, vigils lit up parks and churches across the country. Candles trembled in paper cups. Voices sang her songs in trembling unison. But always, hovering like smoke above the hymns, were the questions that would never be answered. And perhaps that is the cruelest form of loss. Not only the absence of a life, but the absence of explanation. A mystery without solution. An open wound without bandage. Christina Grimmie's death remained exactly that. Not just tragic, but unresolved. In the silence after her death, Christina Grimmie's voice did not vanish. It lingered in recordings, in memories, in the fragile archive of a life lived partly on camera. On YouTube, her covers still played, each video a preserved fragment of her laughter, her humility, her astonishing range. Fans returned to them obsessively, as if replaying the songs might reverse time, as if somewhere inside the chords they could find her again. Her funeral was held in New Jersey, the church filled with flowers and hymns that trembled against the vaulted ceiling. Her casket was carried not by strangers in suits, but by family and friends who wept openly, their grief raw, unhidden. In the front pew, her parents sat hand in hand, the weight of loss pressing down like stone. When her brother spoke, his words were broken by silence, as though language itself refused to hold the enormity of what had been taken. Yet amid the grief, her faith remained central. Christina had lived with a quiet devotion to God, one that informed her openness and her refusal to guard herself against the world. Many who loved her clung to that faith in the days after her death, believing she had not vanished but moved beyond, her voice joining a greater chorus unseen. Still, faith did not erase the ache of absence. It only softened its edges. In Orlando, the venue became a shrine. Fans left flowers at the doors, scrawled messages on paper hearts, lit candles that flickered through the night. Photographs of Christina, smiling, radiant, now stood taped against walls once lined with posters for upcoming shows. The Plaza Live became less a concert hall than a place of mourning, a reminder of how joy can be shattered in an instant. Her death also shifted the industry. Venues across the country reviewed their security policies, installing detectors, hiring guards, instituting checks. The changes were immediate, visible, a quiet acknowledgement that intimacy and openness carried risks that could no longer be ignored. Christina Grimmie had become not only a memory, but a warning, and yet, she was more than a cautionary tale. To those who knew her music, she remained a voice of extraordinary purity, a spirit whose kindness had been her greatest power. In interviews, Adam Levine spoke of her as family, his voice cracking. Fellow musicians recorded tributes, their performances tremoring with grief. Across the world, young singers whispered her name as inspiration, proof that sincerity could reach millions without cynicism or cruelty. The motif of the echo closes her story. Her voice, recorded, replayed, multiplied, became an echo that refused to fade. It was heard in subway stations, where fans played her songs through phone speakers. It was heard in bedrooms, where young people sang along in the half-dark, believing she listened somehow. It was heard in the spaces between silence, where grief transformed into remembrance. Philosophers have said that legacy is the way the dead speak to the living. For Christina Grimmie, legacy was not abstract, it was concrete, audible, still vibrating in the air. Though her life ended in violence, her echo carried love. The same love she had poured into strangers night after night, hug after hug, song after song. In the end, Christina Grimmie's story is not only about loss, it is about the fragile beauty of openness in a world that too often punishes it. It is about the echo of a young woman who sang not to be famous, but to be heard, and who continues to be heard, even in silence. The clock ticks forward, time moves on, but her voice remains, suspended like a note that refuses to resolve, haunting, tender, eternal.